But if it is available to you, please have your cameras on. Nicola, if you could advance again, excuse me. We'll use the raise your hand function. So if you'd like to make a comment or ask a question, this is for CRIS committee members. You may click on the reactions button, pops up a screen, or you can raise your hand, and I'll call on you in the order I see your hand raised. If you're participating by phone, you can hit *9 and that will raise your hand. And as I always say, if all else fails, please just wave your hands and I will note you and work you into the conversation. Nicola, if you could advance the buttons again, please. So we did that one more. For chat today, you may chat with me if you have questions or comments, CRIS committee members. I understand that some of you may prefer to communicate in a written form rather than verbally. So please feel free to use the chat and choose me in the list and I'll track it and work you into the conversation. If you have any technical difficulties, you can reach out to Brittany Thompson, who's here to help manage our tech behind the scenes. So those are the two chat functions you can go for. If you can advance one more time, Nicola. As always, speaker view, if you want to see as many CRIS committee members as possible, click on that speaker view, excuse me, and choose gallery. Advance the screen, please, Nicola. All right, different set of instructions for our members of the public. For most of the meeting, members of the public, I'm going to ask you to keep your mics muted and your video cameras off. And the reason is we have 134 people joining today, 37 of whom are CRIS committee members. In order for me to be able to facilitate conversation with CRIS committee during our CRIS discussions, I need to be able only to see the CRIS committee members. That said, there are two parts of the meeting where I'm going to invite you to turn your cameras on. The first part is during our breakout discussions. We're going to be having the same discussion in the main room, and I'm going to encourage members of the public who are here today to participate in that conversation, at which time, if you would like to, and it's available to you, you may turn on your video camera. I'll let you know when that time comes. And the other time is if you've signed up to make public comment at the end of the meeting, I'll invite you to turn on your camera when it's your turn to make comment. Nicola, if you could advance a couple more times. Speaker view, same instructions. If you'd like to see as many CRIS committee members as possible, click on speaker view and then choose gallery. And then finally, chat today. If you have any technical difficulties, please reach out to Brittany Thompson. You may send chats to me, but because I'm really managing the CRIS committee discussion, I may not be able to respond to your chat. That said, we are recording all of the chats and we will go back through them later. So if you do send something, it won't get lost in the shuffle. All right, so that's it for the tech. One last thing, because we have so many agendas, and this is our so much packed into our agenda, and this is our fourth CRIS committee meeting, we're not going to go through introductions of each CRIS committee member, but I am going to encourage our CRIS committee members when you speak today, if you could start whatever you say by reminding everyone of your name, your role or representation on the committee. This will really help our members of the public and your fellow CRIS committee members track who you are and who you're here representing today. So if you can remember that, that would be fantastic if you wouldn't mind doing that. All right, let's move on to our welcome and introductions on our agenda. And I am going to first ask Representative Orwell if she can say a few words of welcome.
Yes, thank you. I want to start by welcoming everyone to the meeting today. Many of us have been in a 60-day session, and I know you were working hard while we were working hard in Olympia, so I want to say thank you. You know, in Olympia, we talk about different bills that go through, and there's a bill we often call, it's a good little bill, and we kind of laugh about it because we often say, well, it's simple and it's not controversial, and people will say, well, it mustn't do much. And I want to start by saying that House Bill 1477, our 98 bill, was not a simple small bill. It was a large, complex bill. And this process is complex. And, you know, and I think it is because change is hard. And we have this once in a lifetime opportunity really to look at our system and create it in a way that, you know, wherever you are in the state, when you pick up that phone, you get the help you need, right? That it's culturally sensitive, it's responsive. I heard a great term today that was, I often say trauma informed, but I heard from a staff from our Department of Health that healing informed. And so I just want to acknowledge that this process is difficult, but I just want you all to know you are such an important part, whether you're a member of the CRIS committee or you hear from the public, that this is something we're doing together. I also want to say I'm really excited about the agenda today. And I want to thank the staff that set this up. You know, you're going to be receiving a lot of updates. I'm really excited that SAMHSA and the talented staff are here, and I want to start by thanking them. You really have done so much around 988 at the national level, and you highlight best practices, and you've been our beacon of light, kind of helping us find the way. And so I want to say thank you. And I'm also really excited because we're going to be doing conversations about how we center equity in our conversation as we reform our system. You know, I had to build a session on language access in the K-12 system. And I thought about at the end of the session, it's like we need to talk about language access and behavioral health, right? In both spoken and sign, and how we incorporate that into our system. So I look forward to these conversations today. Thank you for being here. Never hesitate to reach out. Have a good meeting.
Thank you, Representative Orwell. And now I'm going to ask Carrie Waterland with HCA to offer the land acknowledgement today.
Hello, everyone. And please join me in acknowledging that today I'm coming to you from land that was the traditional territory of the Puyallup tribe. I acknowledge that tribal governments play an important role in all of the work that we do. And I invite all of us to remember that there are roles in taking care of these lands that tribal governments participate in, and that we too, as stewards and partners, must continue to take place and part in. I wanted to do a call of action today to let everyone know that leaning in and supporting the lands and the people and the community and the commitment that we all show to Washington State is something that is the forefront of my mind today. With that, I wanted to thank everyone and welcome you to the CRIS committee meeting today. I apologize for my brevity, but we have a huge agenda and wanted to just let everyone know I appreciate tribal government, and again, coming to you from the Puyallup tribal lands. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carrie. Appreciate you doing that. Nicola, if you could put the agenda back up, I will walk folks through our objectives and agenda today. As Carrie said, we do have a pretty jam-packed agenda. Oh, sorry, Elizabeth is sharing, apologies. I'm just going to walk you briefly through our objectives and then make sure everybody knows when things are going to be happening. So, oops. So our first objective for today is to continue laying the foundation for collaboration. We also want to provide you with an update on the launch of the 988 line from a national perspective. I know a lot of you have a number of questions about that, so hopefully we'll get some more intelligence on that today. Share some other updates relevant to the CRIS committee. That's one of our standing agenda items. And then update you on the progress of developing a vision for the crisis response system. Our discussion today will be about centering equity on our work. This is something we started back in our November meeting and are continuing with this today. And then we'll confirm action items and next steps and move into public comment. So Elizabeth, if you could advance the screen to the next slide. So we are moving into our personal story next at 1:20 or thereabouts. And then after that, we're going to devote 30 minutes to hearing an update for the SAMHSA 988 line. At 2:05, we will hear some CRIS updates, legislative update, and some updates from our agencies, as well as updates from HMA. We'll take a break at 2:25 and then come back together to get an update on the process of developing a vision for our CRIS work. And then at 2:45, we'll move into our breakouts and do discussion around centering equity in our work. Members of the public can also participate in that discussion here in the main room with me. And then at 3:35, we'll do action items and next steps and move into our public comment period at 3:38, adjourn at 4 o'clock today. So we can stop the screen share now. Excuse me. And I'm going to ask Bipasha Mukherjee, one of our steering committee members, and Jim Bollendroff to introduce our personal story today.
It's the whole unmute thing. Hi, the CRIS committee agreed that our work must be grounded in the diverse experience of people who live with mental health or substance use issues, their family and friends. As such, we intentionally start our sessions by hearing personal stories. Today, I have the honor of introducing Puck, who, like me, is a CRIS committee member representing lived experience. Puck has a long history in creating and supporting multiple spaces for LGBTQ+ people, including starting a support group in their high school when this was not common. They have and continue to work on several projects where LGBTQ+ issues intersect with that of people of color, disability, wealth inequity, suicide prevention, and mental health. This is Puck.
Hey folks, I'm Puck. I am from Yakima, Washington, and I think we can hear me. Okay, cool. So I use they pronouns like Puck spoke at the CRIS meeting and they had a lot of feelings. So last month, someone from the CRIS reached out to me about maybe telling my story to open up the meeting. And I said, no, maybe later, because I've barely been dragging myself through existence lately. Last week, they asked again, well, my grandfather was in hospice. I grabbed the Seattle Times for his obituary and I found suicide, I found suicide hotline gets funding boost and new 3-digit number. So that's exciting. So this story is less necessarily my story and more a look at mental health in trans and non-binary communities, because that's my story. I'm going to talk some about my own experiences, but I also make some generalizations. These come from observations I've made while working intimately with these communities for 20 years, but they're also borne out by data. My partner is a statistics professor, so they have to be borne out by data. The main study I cite is the US Trans Survey, which in 2015 surveyed nearly 28,000 trans individuals. Their site is ustranssurvey.org. I sent Nicola my addresses for my citations. Those will be in the chat after I'm done. So the data here is grim. And if you have lived experience as a trans person and or are a person of color who's embraced by trans folks, maybe take a break instead. I'll be talking for about 10 more minutes if you want to stretch and get a snack. If you need any support after this, please reach out to Trans Lifeline. And if they're too busy to answer, please try back a bit later. They are trans run exclusively, volunteer run, so they're busy, but they want to talk to you. I also have a printable poster / zine of helpful reminders for trans folks and our friends, which you can get at bit.ly/reminderszine. Again, I will have links later. So, housekeeping aside, who is a Puck? Since we're here to talk about mental health, that's what we'll do. So I'm 36. I saw my first therapist before I had my first date. I was 13, 14 as I transitioned from middle school to high school, and my tiny honors classes with individualized instruction turned into giant lecture style courses with me and a bunch of noisy juniors. I couldn't keep up, and I complained that I was stressed and sad because I was having trouble getting my work done. I was diagnosed with anxiety and depression and medicated to no avail. I flailed my way through college. I say that my degree from Evergreen is in gender, sexuality, and community, so I guess that puts us here. And I struggled my way into the workforce with some trauma along the way. By the time I was 32, I was ready to give up on capitalism for the second time, and I was denied by disability for the second and third times. At this point, I was desperate. I was agoraphobic, frequently in severe pain from my anxiety, and was considering electroconvulsive therapy. I had dealt with chronic misdiagnosis and had been treated for mental health conditions through meds, job coaching, surgery, mindfulness, diet, and hours upon hours of talk therapy. Those treatments gave me some helpful tools, but they ultimately made me feel like a failure, like the failure in treatment was my fault. I was working my hardest and still was never successful. So there must be something wrong with me. And then I had an encounter with a counselor who thought the same thing. After we had been working together for a year, I was doing my best. She scolded me for the failings that I had come in saying that I would have: being on time, doing homework, remembering when my appointments were. And she spat a heavily pathologized misdiagnosis at me as an explanation that felt like punishment, and still makes me feel like complaining against her would be invalidated by, oh, Puck's just making excuses for not working hard enough. So after sobbing my way out of that appointment and recovering from the surgery I had scheduled for the next day, I visited my primary care provider. At some point in the past year, she had sat with me for an hour listening to my jumbled medical history. She was a little scatterbrained, but was super sweet. I mentioned to my partner that I liked her. Her brain worked like mine. So I recounted my crappy therapy experience to her and mentioned that I had asked if my therapist thought I might have ADHD. My primary care provider said, "Oh my God, you have ADHD. I have ADHD. My kids have ADHD. How did we miss that you have ADHD?" The rest of the story doesn't follow the traditional "and then it got better" narrative structure. So if you want a happy ending, remember this part. With treatment for ADHD, the world is still hard, but it's so much less hard. I went from psych medication roulette to let's try this, and seeing my executive functioning skills improve immediately. So that was when I was 32. ADHD is underdiagnosed in people who are assigned female or raised as girls. One reason for that is that a lot of symptoms don't show up until puberty. Estrogen does some of the work to make up for ADHD's dopamine weirdness. So when you start seeing hormone fluctuations, you see some chaos there. But another reason is cultural. As girls are raised, we teach them masking behaviors. We teach them how to watch the people around them as an indicator of how they should then perform. These behaviors tell young people to not be socially deviant, so potential signs of ADHD are often stifled. I was a quick, white, charming only child, so I ended up in gifted programs instead of in special ed classes. As I grew up, I naturally applied my masking lessons to try to figure out how to do gender. I never really understood gender differences, so I watched and I tried to learn. One of the first lessons I remember about gender variance happened when the musical artist Prince changed his name to a symbol. From the mocking media coverage of Prince's gender play, I learned that people were disgusted by non-binary identities. I was 7. So, an exercise. I think that when people try to imagine what it's like to be trans, they try to imagine wanting to be different. If you're, say, a man who is trying to imagine wanting to be a woman, you're not going to be successful putting yourself in trans folks' shoes. The imagine exercise here is imagining that, yes, you are a man or a woman, but your family and your friends don't see that for some reason. They keep missing an essential part of your identity and treating you as something that you're not. You have no option but to try to get them to understand that, no, you're a man. But a lot of times that push for just basic understanding is punished by telling you that you're acting out, you're taking up too much space, you're asking for too much. So I was 16 when I came across the word genderqueer, and it explained a lot of things that had been confusing me about the world. Neither man or woman had ever seemed right. My feminist family, when I came out to them, asked, couldn't I just change what woman meant? But I don't have that power in society. I identify as genderqueer, but these days, a lot of genderqueer then folks identify as non-binary. It's just kind of a personal preference around the term. So since then, since the late 90s, the cultural images we saw, it's gotten a little bit better, but the cultural images we saw of trans people mostly then involved us dying violently. So as a young person, I missed some of the nuance, the fact that this was mostly happening to trans women, and especially trans women of color, but I was firmly convinced that I wouldn't have a future. I work as a mentor with trans youth, and unfortunately, this is still not an uncommon assumption. I hope to eventually live in a world where it's not a novelty to be a real-life trans adult. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like that world is coming as soon as I would hope. 4.6% of people in the United States have attempted suicide in their lifetime. That's 4.6%. Within the trans community, that number is 40%, 40. Of the US population, 0.6% have attempted suicide in the past year. In the trans community, it's nearly 12 times as many, 7%. Whenever I look at these numbers, I start with denial because 40% is unbelievable. But then I look at my community, at how many of my friends have gone through rough patches, and 40% seems almost reasonable, kind of low, actually. I spend a lot of time trying to figure out why this is the case, and I come back to how we've all been ground down by anti-trans rhetoric. There's a meta-analysis called Perceived Discrimination in Health that looked at 134 studies and confirmed that perceived discrimination has significant negative effect on both mental and physical health, and also produces significantly heightened stress response. So it makes sense that when the trans survey assessed the number of people who had experienced serious psychological distress, which they use the K6 scale and is defined as mental health problems that are severe enough to cause moderate to serious impairment in social, occupational, or school functioning and to require treatment. In the month leading up to the survey, 39% of trans people studied had experienced serious psychological distress, compared to, at that time, a baseline of 5% of the general US population. There's good news, though. The study finds that trans people with supportive families are substantially less distressed than otherwise. Well, that's good news until we see things like the shenanigans that are happening in Texas, where the governor and attorney general tried to frame providing appropriate healthcare to gender variant children as child abuse. This all is why I had to tell this story today, because this action and similar tactics are functionally psychological warfare. There are so many fronts in which these actions are horrendous. To start with, trans youth are incredibly lucky if they have supportive families or access to supportive healthcare. We know that trans youth, and especially trans youth of color, are already disproportionately overrepresented in the foster care system. Furthermore, just suggesting that a class of people providing medical care within the scope of their medical training are inherently abusive is absurd. Can you imagine having that happen to you where the leadership in your state is doing that to your community? Throughout the US, we're seeing proposed legislation that harms trans communities in two distinct ways. On one hand, these bills are harmful to the community directly if, and unfortunately when, they become laws. But this trend also harms trans communities indirectly by sending out the message that we are not welcome in society. The anti-trans fear-mongering is further advanced through a boogeyman spectacle of some evil man who decides to pretend to be a woman so that he can target women by using their bathrooms or competing in sports or being housed in prison or living in society as a professional person. I shouldn't need to say it, but trans people are just normal people who want to do normal things. The number of people surveyed who, within the past year, had reduced how much they ate or drank in order to avoid having to use the restroom is 32%. My partner started doing that in the first grade. So living in this stew of hate understandably harms the trans community's mental health. And then the bad statistics are weaponized to say, hey, trans people are disproportionately suicidal. It must be because you have to be crazy to be trans, or being trans makes you depressed. It's not that. I've been reading The Room since I was 7, and it's not that. The stew of hate and its effects have been traumatic for me. So at this point, I'm looking for a therapist who is trans competent, knows about how ADHD makes my brain different and can come up with solutions for those challenges, and knows about complex PTSD. It's been a lot of trial and error to figure out what I need. I had an amazing counselor when I lived in California, but I've been looking for someone new since I moved to Yakima in October of 2019. A trend I've seen, it's in the survey somewhere too, is people giving up on seeking help because it's too hard. And I get it. Have you tried looking for a therapist? It's hard. Sorry, my cat is yelling at birds. But in general, finding a therapist is hard. As you need more specific things, it's harder. Psychology today lets you narrow your search by areas of specialty, but it seems like the transgender allied box there often means I've met a trans person once, rather than we'll be able to do a session where you don't have to educate me on trans issues. As I do a search for ADHD, trauma, transgender, and Yakima, I find 4 individuals, 3 of whom are half an hour away over a mountain. Elsewhere in the state, I'm hearing about full books and wait lists. So we disproportionately need support. We don't have preventative mental health care. And then we get to the point of crisis, and what? 57% of us are uncomfortable asking the police for help because we get treated disrespectfully. Again, I'm sharing numbers for all trans people. So numbers for communities of color, for disabled people are even harder to look at, but they're true. So we end up at the ER and we interact with staff who are well-meaning but make mistakes. And we feel unseen, disrespected, not able to engage with the process. The last time I supported a friend in the ER, they were released to community care and they didn't feel safe with their counselor. I can't do Suicide Watch full-time. Since I'm not agency affiliated, I've been on a wait list for peer counselor training since I applied in 2013. The peer model wants me to be in recovery, but while my life is relatively stable now, which is what recovery looks like to me, I can't imagine that I will ever be recovered enough to succeed within a traditional work schedule. So I'm kind of just in the wind. So anyway, I've been doing this work for 20 years and I'm tired of grief. This isn't a story with a happy ending until we fix the system, which involves to start figuring out how to address individuals' biases within the workforce. It involves non-police crisis options. It involves paying on-the-ground staff enough to actually care. It involves ensuring that the community has access to education and training to provide support to itself. I don't know. I'm tired. Thank you.
Thank you, Puck. Thank you for that incredible story and for your incredible vulnerability and willingness to share. What I believe this committee really needs to hear, and that is that there is a lot of work to do. There's a